An Indiana mother entered a guilty plea, essentially admitting that she starved her 2-month-old baby. And emergency personnel who saw his tiny little body said the newborn looked like a Holocaust victim. But the woman's punishment is honestly pretty shocking. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. All right, so we have this update to a story that we first brought you back in November, and it's something I'm trying to make sense of because I just don't quite get it. Because this is when 26-year-old Indiana mother Kristen Deininger was charged with 2 counts of neglect of a dependent resulting in serious bodily injury. I want to expand upon that for you. Specifically, she was charged with placing her young child in a situation endangering his life or health and depriving him of necessary support. Because here, she almost starved her 2-month-old baby to death. That is what we're talking about. And here's the part, again, I'm not quite sure I understand. Because we have learned that despite entering a guilty plea and admitting to what she'd done, Deininger won't spend any time in prison. So to chat all about this, I want to bring on Josh Corman. He is a former child abuse prosecutor. Thanks so much for taking the time, Josh, to come here on Sidebar.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Now, Josh, I want to save the discussion on her sentence for later on, because I first want to lay out the story, and then we will get into her sentence and why that happened. But generally speaking, in this case, to say an infant, practically a newborn, looks like a Holocaust victim, because that's the description that was attributed here, has to be one of the worst things I've ever heard. Where does it stack up for you in your career?
Sadly, I think it does. I think anybody who sees children at all, anytime you have cases involving kids, whether it's child abuse or sexual abuse, automatically everyone's heart goes out to a victim when the victim is a child, but especially when you have a 2-month-old child in this situation who clearly couldn't do anything for themselves and is dependent upon the mother to feed them and nourishment and care for them. And obviously that was not getting done. So, I think anybody, it sounds like law enforcement, the people in the hospital, DCS, anybody who touched this case at all, even this roommate who was the person who took the child to the hospital, clearly everyone's, I guess, sentiments would go towards that child and their sympathies towards the child.
I think you nailed it right on the head. That vulnerability, that aspect where they are certainly dependent on another for care, and it was a failure in the most egregious sense of the word. So let me give everybody a little background on this just horrific story. So we go back to November 6th, 2024, and a Department of Child Services case manager in Evansville, Indiana, responded to a hospital where a baby boy was suffering from malnutrition, starvation, and dehydration. And it was actually Deininger's roommate who finally rushed the boy to the ER. And thank goodness for that, because this could have had much different consequences. But hospital workers, they found that the 2-month-old actually weighed less on the day he was brought in than he did on the day he was born. Process that. By a whole 2 ounces, by the way. You know how terrifying that is? When he was born in August, he weighed 6 pounds, 8 ounces. When he showed up at the hospital on November 6th, he reportedly weighed 6 pounds, 6 ounces. Now, Josh, again, lucky to be alive, right? First of all, A, lucky for this child to be alive. And B, do you see concerned citizens stepping in cases like this?
Well, absolutely. And in this case, DCS was referred the case from the hospital, which is generally how these cases get referred to law enforcement all the time. Someone brings a child into the hospital, or, someone at the school or a relative or neighbor or somebody feels concerned, and then they call and they make a referral to Children's Services. I think the hospital did the same thing. They're mandatory reporters under the law. So anytime someone comes in and they feel that there's potential for, either child abuse or child neglect or sexual abuse or something like that, it's their responsibility to make that referral to Children's Services, who then also works with law enforcement to investigate these kind of cases. And this is the kind of thing that sadly does happen, day in, day out across our country.
It's hard to even imagine that, but you're 100% right. When we go a little bit more into this, to give everybody, again, a full explanation before we get into what the sentence was here. So, according to a probable cause affidavit, it reads, quote, The victim was taken by his mother, Kristen Donay, to a regular checkup on September 11th, 2024, and was found to be underweight. A follow-up appointment was scheduled for 4 weeks later, but was canceled by Donay, and no attempt was made by Donay to reschedule the appointment. By the way, quick sidebar from Sidebar. As you know, we cover some pretty scary stuff on here. You want to hear something scary? Do you know that your personal data is being harvested and sold online by data brokers? Yeah, anyone can buy your personal details. And when that happens, you're at risk for a whole host of things. Identity theft, becoming a target of phishing scams, potentially stalking. And that is why I'm so happy to tell you about our sponsor, Delete Me. Delete Me helps keep your personal information private. Apparently, dozens of data brokers had my personal information. It was on a ton of listings, but Delete Me jumped in and helped remove it. And by the way, they will keep monitoring the sites for you so your information doesn't find its way back on there after the first removal. And honestly, using Delete Me has given me peace of mind about my family too, because if someone buys your data via data broker, they can see information about your relatives too. So right now you can get 20% off Delete Me and protect your personal data when you go to joindeleteme.com/sidebar and make sure to use promo code sidebar at checkout. So because of the malnutrition and starvation, the caseworker said he could see the baby's skin hanging off his arms, loose skin on his legs, torso. Unthinkable, unthinkable. Now, according to the affidavit, Donay didn't bother coming down to the hospital until hours later. Josh, what does that all tell you? The fact that, not taking to the appointment, not showing up to the hospital. What does that tell you?
Well, it's obviously concerning for everybody, right? Just take our legal hats off, but just common sense and just, people with moral character. A mother not taking care of their kids or not taking your kid to the doctor when you know that there's a serious problem, or once the child was in the hospital, like you said, I think the reports made some comments that she didn't help feed the child at night, like she left it up to the hospital to feed her child even after the child had been admitted to the hospital. Obviously, that causes serious concerns for everybody, right? Certainly the people are investigating it, and I would have also have thought for the prosecutor, for the court, and even for her attorney who representing her in this, just kind of like the depraved indifference or the lack of care, the lack of remorse in it is certainly a concern, and it makes you wonder if there's some other things that are going on behind the scenes, right? If she was suffering from some kind of mental health problems or postpartum, or if she had a drug problem, or what was going on. Because I know it was reported also that she made a comment before that, she had a lot going on with work and was stressed out with work at the Family Dollar store. So to a lot of us, things that like that, we can't wrap our head around that. That doesn't make any sense to us. But it seems that she certainly wasn't thinking the same way that we would think. So I guess then to kind of get back into legal analysis of that, then that begs the question of, well, what was going on in her mind? What was her intent in this neglect? Because neglect doesn't just mean being negligent, like not doing what you're supposed to be doing. It means like a conscious disregard, intentionally not doing what you should have been doing to care for your child. And why anybody would do that certainly begs the question. And maybe that's some of the information that came out in this case for why the case was disposed the way it was.
Yeah. Authorities say Donay had a really hard time confirming to the medical staff exactly how much she was feeding this baby boy and how often. At first, she said she was feeding him 1 ounce of formula 6 times a day. Later, seems like she changed her story. You go back to the affidavit. When the case manager spoke with the attending physician, that doctor, quote, confirmed that the baby boy was diagnosed with dehydration and emaciated temporal waste in the eyes and cheeks resulting from malnutrition. An example provided in the report of emaciated temporal waste is the sunken cheeks and eyes of Holocaust victims suffering from starvation and malnutrition. Talk about a comparison. Now, the affidavit says that while they were staying in the hospital, medical staff reportedly discovered that Donay wasn't actually feeding her baby overnight, and the staff would have to handle those feedings. And according to the affidavit, quote, after testing and observation by medical staff, it was determined that the victim did not suffer from any medical conditions that would have caused the weight loss. So Josh, that defense is out the window, right? I'm doing all the right thing. I'm feeding him, but there might be some condition where the baby's not intaking the proper nutrients or can't swallow the nutrients. The idea that the baby wasn't suffering from that kind of condition, that defeats that kind of defense, right?
Well, it certainly hampers that defense. I think that's the first thing that would come to mind in defending a case like this is, and that's often what does happen, right? There's a lot of times that kids lose weight after they're born, or they don't take to the formula, or breastfeeding is a difficult thing for a mother and for a child to go through. And so, especially at 2 months old, you have kids that are having issues with weight and, gaining weight and maturing. In this case, you're right. That seems to have gone out. At least that there's some medical evidence that was not a. Um, I guess that's not a defense here. That wasn't an issue with this particular child. As well as I think once the child was in foster care, I think gained a considerable amount of weight within a very short period of time, which again kind of takes away the defense that there was something medically wrong with the child. But again, also it makes you wonder in this case that this wasn't something that she was doing by herself. She had a roommate. I think she also lived with her brother. So it also kind of begs the question during the investigation, what other evidence may have come out regarding those two people? Certainly, it may not be their responsibility to care for this child, but if she was working, clearly this child was not in a daycare facility where a daycare would be seeing this child on a daily basis. So it also begs the question of what the other people involved in this child's life, where were they? And what was their role in this, or at least what knowledge do they have about these problems before the child was taken to the hospital?
Those are fair questions. And talking about the care of the child, not a shocker here. The baby was, of course, removed from Donay's custody. Immediately when that happened, this baby started to improve, gaining more than a pound in just a few days. By the time he got to his next checkup with his foster family, he gained a whole 3 pounds. The doctors at the hospital reportedly told investigators that if the roommate hadn't brought that baby to the ER, he almost certainly would have died of starvation. So again, Josh, it shows how if there was more care, he wouldn't have been in this state. It makes you also wonder, could you have charged attempted murder here?
I don't know specifically Indiana law well enough to say if you could have done that or not, but obviously if at some point in time, I think that may have been a possible charge. And again, I don't know what all the medical medical evidence that came back. And, I know he said if the child hadn't have gotten care, then the child would have died, but I don't know what the period of time would have been. Certainly, like if you don't get fed, then you're going to starve to death and you're going to die. I don't know how long it would have taken for that to happen. I'm sure that was some discussions that were had. Obviously, child abuse, even in Indiana or wherever, can be serious felonies that carry serious amounts of prison time and could even result in murder charges or I guess the highest rank or highest level of sentencing. So certainly, if the child had died or even suffered, I guess, permanent disability or something because of that, then I think an attempted murder charge very well may have happened.
Again, we're going to get to the point about after her sentence, no prison time in a second, because as we're going through the details and they're getting worse, you might be asking that question. But how did we get to this point, right? So the deputy who wrote up the affidavit questioned Donay about the baby, referred to, by the way, as V1 or Victim 1 in this affidavit. And it reads, Kristen advised V1 had experienced difficulty when digesting formula when fed and would spit up the majority of what he ingested shortly after eating. Kristen advised she was aware that V1 was not eating properly and as a result, not being provided the essential nutrients that an infant of his age would require, knowledge component. So Donay told the deputy that while she was feeding this baby 1 ounce of formula 6 times a day, she doesn't know how much he was actually able to keep down without spitting it up. And she said she waited to take him to a scheduled visit, but then didn't take him to his follow-up appointment even after she noticed he was losing weight. She also admitted she never took him to the emergency room, despite the fact that he was obviously getting worse. And now this next part of the affidavit is honestly pretty infuriating, to say the least. It reads, Kristen advised her friend was the person who decided to take V1 to the hospital for treatment on November 6, 2024, while she remained home to rest after working her shift at Dollar General store. Kristen advised she generally worked 15 to 20 hours per week at Dollar General store. Kristen advised she had numerous things going on in her personal life and work as reasons for not taking V1 to the hospital after noticing that he was losing weight and not thriving. Josh, feels like that is not really a defense. Do you see that? Where parents say, look, I meant well, but I was just so busy. I'm doing this alone. I didn't know what to do. I was doing the best I could. Because again, she had acknowledged the dangers here. She admitted that she knew her child could die. But is that a viable defense ever?
I don't think so. I think what you said initially is correct. I have a lot of clients that will say I was doing everything I could. I was overwhelmed. There was nobody there to help me. I reached out for help, or whether DCS was supposed to do this for me or do that for me, or the father wasn't around. A million excuses of why someone got overwhelmed and didn't do what they're supposed to do. It's the way the affidavit reads in this case, which of course that's the way that the deputy has written it. Sounds very flippant about everything, right? Is it like I'm working this part-time job at Family Dollar and that just overwhelmed my life and I don't have time to take care of this. I think that's kind of the most disheartening about it when you're thinking about a child and a 2-month-old child and the way you've described their physical appearance, and then the mother's response just seems to almost be carefree. I think that, and again, that's the way the affidavit reads, and of course, that's the way the officer is writing it up for their probable cause statement, and they're doing that for a reason. But those are certainly quotations that are very, very concerning, just common sense wise, and obviously for anyone defending her and prosecuting her.
And that's what I want to talk about now, the prosecution, the law. So let me get into this. This is the part that I really want to talk about. So court records indicated that Deininger never made bail, so she was locked up until February 12th when she was released. And her sentencing order shows that she entered a plea to 2 charges of neglect of a dependent resulting in serious injury. So there was a focus on 2 different parts of the statute, that the defendant put the dependent in a situation that endangered the dependent's life or health, and that they deprived the dependent of necessary support. Now, under the part of the form that talks about her punishment, it shows that for count 1 and count 2, she's sentenced to 3 years in prison to run concurrently, meaning at the same time. But then it says that the entire sentence is suspended. So really, all that she is facing is probation. And the court records state that Deininger is a low risk to reoffend, has no prior criminal history, that she accepted responsibility. Josh, really? This is the appropriate conclusion?
Well, whether it's appropriate or not, I guess to some extent you kind of have to say it sounds like her attorney did an excellent job in representing her, and for whatever reason, the prosecutor saw fit to make this kind of a plea offer. And that's, in all of these cases, there's so much going on behind the scenes and in the discovery that we don't know about, just from what we're able to read and find out about this case. But yes, getting, I guess, for a level 3 felony, getting the minimum sentence. And again, this doesn't mean that she's not going to end up facing any prison time. If she continues to have the attitude that we have talked about so far, then it sounds like she very well might walk herself into violating her probation and end up having to serve that 3-year sentence. But if she had no record at all, and maybe perhaps that she even voluntarily relinquished her rights to the child, or she made some other concessions. I don't know what all was going on behind the scenes, but it sounds like she got a very good plea deal.
Is it a possibility there was a weakness in the prosecution's case? I don't really know what that would be. I don't really see it. I'm not sure I quite understand it. Look, I'll tell you, I get it. You don't want to take this to trial. You don't want to expose jurors to all of this. I mean, they'd have to see the photos of that child. I can imagine how difficult that would be. But at the same time, no prison time for what almost resulted in the death of her child, who was, again, so defenseless, so vulnerable. Would you want to send a message to other parents out there? I'm curious if there was some sort of, you mentioned we don't know what's happening behind the scenes, why a prosecutor or prosecutors would sign off on this.
Well, the prosecutor has all the power, and that's what I tell people all the time. When I was a prosecutor and now as a defense attorney, when I'm negotiating and talking with my clients, I'm like, we're going to do everything we can working with the prosecutor to try to get the disposition that we want out of. So I don't know what was going on with the prosecutor's mind with the case, if there were problems with the case. Maybe there were issues with the other witnesses they had, or if there was someone not around. Again, maybe she has some mental health issues, or maybe she had some, who knows what may be in her background that they were taking into consideration, as well as whatever had been going on since she had been in custody. Maybe the amount of months that she had been in custody, we don't think that that's sufficient. But between the court and the prosecutor and the defense attorney, they felt like this was a good resolution. And just for us looking at it from the outside, I would think that, yes, she got a very good plea negotiation, a very good plea deal. Her attorney did an excellent job on her behalf. But again, the prosecutor has all the power to make these decisions and these offers, and I would assume that they had a good reason for making that, although we don't necessarily know what that was.
Let me ask you this, conclude on this point. So court records show that any contact between Donay and her baby, that is going to be left up to the discretion of the Department of Children's Services. Do you see any circumstance where she will ever see or take care of her child again? Is there anything stopping her from having more children?
So nothing's stopping her from having more children. However, I think what typically happens in these kind of cases is there's a dual investigation, or these cases are basically being prosecuted in two different courtrooms. So the criminal part of the case, which is what we've been talking about, but then you also have the part where DCS has been involved in the case and the family law judge will be involved in the case. That is the part where they talk about visitation or custody, or if she could ever get any kind of custody back for her child. And that will have to go through a different hearing, different level of evidence. And ultimately, the state has the right to seek a petition to terminate her parental rights, which, sometimes we refer to that as being like the civil death penalty. So it could be that if the state decides to pursue that, then she would never have any contact with her child again and she would lose all rights. Otherwise, there will continue to be hearings in court. And yes, she could eventually get custody of her child back if the court deems that that's in the best interest of the child and she's made whatever changes that they want her to make. But that would be something separate from what goes on in the criminal part of the case.
It's tough to know what the right answer is here, but I will tell you, just a very, very disturbing case. But I'll emphasize this one more time. It could have had much different consequences, and thank goodness this baby was rushed to emergency services when he was, and thank goodness he is alive. Josh Corman, thank you so much for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.